Hi, I'm Damon Mitchell.
And I'm Chip Tafrate.
We are two clinical psychologists who work in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Central Connecticut State University. And over the past 10 years or so, we've spent a good deal of time studying effective assessment and intervention with justice involved clients. Our work has led us to develop several assessment tools, as well as CBT intervention programs for use by adult and juvenile probation officers. And the psychology of criminal conduct and the risk need responsivity model has served as the foundation for the work that we do in those arenas and how we go about doing it.
And we also have the good fortune of sitting down regularly with probation officers and case managers. And we talk about the latest science, we create intervention strategies, and we send these practitioners out to take the new strategies for a test drive, and they come back with recordings. We see what works, we get rid of what doesn't, and we look at recidivism rates along the way.
This podcast, with a little visual enhancement and a recorded work sample, provides a snapshot of our approach when it comes to applying the R&R model to working with justice-involved clients. We call our approach forensic cognitive behavioral therapy, and if you're interested in learning about it in more detail, please check out our books, Forensic Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, which has a chapter co-authored by Jim Bonta, and our book CBT with Justice-Involved Clients, which was written with our late and esteemed colleague, Dave Simord.
So, Damon, the term we tend to use on our work, criminogenic thinking, may be unfamiliar to some listeners because there's so many terms out there to describe this risk area. Terms like criminal thinking, antisocial cognition, antisocial attitudes, pro-criminal attitudes, criminal thought process, criminal mindedness, and so on. So why criminogenic thinking? What does it mean?
All right, first, let's start with a definition. So we're talking about the thinking that facilitates criminal behavior, as well as behaviors that are harmful to others and that are self-destructive. So we take a broad view of criminogenic thinking, and I want to take a minute to note all three of those different aspects. So first, obviously, criminogenic thinking is about the thinking that drives criminal behavior. But it's not just about why somebody robs a bank or sells drugs or whatnot. If you look at the middle column, you see that it's also about the thinking that drives behaviors that may not technically be felonies, but which are antisocial, which are harmful to others, maybe financially, physically, emotionally. And then if you look at the column on the right, you can see that criminogenic thinking is also about the thinking that drives the self-destructive patterns so often seen in justice-involved clients, those tendencies to shoot themselves in the foot over and over again. So the thinking can be destructive in multiple ways, not just technically criminally. Also, it's important to note that the thinking itself is not illegal or criminal. It's just thinking. So for these reasons, I like to use the term criminogenic thinking rather than criminal thinking per se. It just seems more applicable. And that term also ties in with another term that you see in the mental health CBT literature, which is depressogenic thinking. That's used to describe the thinking style of clients who are at risk for depressive disorder. The thinking itself isn't a depressive disorder, but it facilitates the kind of emotional excess in the same way that you might think that criminogenic thinking can facilitate justice involvement and antisocial conduct.
And I would just add that, like, depressogenic thinking is not unique to people with a diagnosis of a depressive disorder. Criminogenic thinking is not unique to people involved with the criminal justice system. And it turns out that criminogenic thinking is something we all have to one degree or another. And Damon, you and I make this point in our training workshops. We often ask participants to pair up and do a brief experiment. And we call this type of exercise a real play. And so we'd like to do a version of that experiment right now. And I'd ask people listening to think about your own life and think about something that you do or don't do that's not helpful or healthy. And most people pick some type of lifestyle issue, such as poor eating habits, reckless driving, spending too much money, maybe staying up too late or procrastinating. So thinking about that type of menu as a guide, pick something like that, which is a current problem for you. And so I'd also ask people to think about the most recent example where they did that self-defeating behavior. Remember, this is a behavior you're not supposed to do, and you know you're not supposed to do it, but you do it anyway. All right, so once you have that in mind, now identify what you were telling yourself right before you engaged in this self-defeating behavior. What were the specific thoughts that went through your mind that gave you permission in the moment to do it? And I'll give you a few seconds to come up with your own thinking.
Now, if you're like most people in our training workshops, you probably have thoughts that sound a little bit like this when you make those destructive decisions. You say to yourself, I've had a long day. I deserve it. Just this one time. No one will know. It's not really hurting anyone, so why not? In the exercise, it quickly becomes obvious to our trainees that they can sound a lot like justice-involved clients because we all have criminogenic thinking moments. So this exercise is beneficial because once practitioners understand the nature of criminogenic thinking, even in themselves, they know what to look for in their clients. And it's that permission-giving moment prior to a risky or criminal behavior.
So we also do something else in this exercise. And since justice-involved clients are not making risky decisions 100% of the time, it's also instructive to identify the other voice, their pro-social thinking, when healthier choices are made. To that end, let's do the second half of the real play. And for those listening, again, think of a recent example where you made a better or healthier decision around the self-defeating issue that you identified earlier. And once again, what were you telling yourself right before you made that healthier choice, even though you really wanted to give in and do the unhealthy thing? So take a second to identify that set of thoughts. You should probably notice that the two sets of thoughts sound different in your mind and lead to two different outcomes. We then end the real play by having the practitioner summarize the two voices from the client, the voice that leads to the self-defeating behavior and that other voice that leads to the healthier outcome.
And that part is important because changing criminogenic thinking doesn't just involve a weakening of the destructive thinking, it also involves a gradual strengthening of the pro-social thinking that's already at least somewhat present in the client.
So now that we've explained what we mean by criminogenic thinking, we're going to move on and talk about how we integrate criminogenic thinking into CBT interventions. And for listeners who are trained in CBT with clients who have mental health problems, there are two major differences to consider in applying CBT to criminal behavior.
Right. The first major difference is the emphasis on decision-making rather than emotion. Traditional CBT models ask clients to identify the thoughts that precede their symptoms, which means symptoms usually related to episodes of anxiety or depression. But because criminal behavior is not often driven by symptoms of depression or anxiety, our focus in forensic CBT is on the thinking that precedes specific instances of antisocial behavior. So our focus is on decision-making rather than symptoms.
And the second critical difference is the nature or the content of the thinking that's driving those decisions. And that's where criminogenic thinking comes in. As you've probably already noticed, criminogenic thinking sounds different than the kinds of thinking that you hear in people with traditional mental health problems, such as anxiety and depression. An example of anxious thinking in the workplace would sound like, I know my boss is going to fire me if I'm late again, and then I'll never find another job. Whereas criminogenic thinking sounds like, hey, it's no big deal if I'm late for work. Nothing much happens in the first hour of my shift anyway. My boss is lucky that I show up to begin with. For many listeners who've been trained in CBT, there are some traditional thinking patterns for mental health that are common. In fact, practitioners have been trained to key into them. One such pattern is overestimating danger, and that is central for individuals who worry a lot and suffer from generalized anxiety disorder. These types of individuals tend to make predictions that things are going to turn out badly much of the time when they really don't. And in understanding the inner worlds of your justice-involved clients, they may tend to do the opposite and not overestimate danger, but rather underestimate danger. And they may think things like, I can sell drugs on my block because I know all my clients. I guess what we're saying is that criminogenic thinking can sometimes look like the polar opposite of thinking that drives mental health problems.
Another complexity is that criminogenic thinking is multifaceted. It's not one single cognitive pattern. Our model of criminogenic thinking patterns is based on the empirical literature that emerged since the mid-1990s around a collection of self-report criminogenic thinking assessment instruments. And when considered as a whole, this literature reveals 13 broad spectrum thinking patterns that can be useful in guiding interventions. While there are 13 patterns overall, keep in mind that no client is going to have all 13 patterns. For any given client, there will probably be just a few patterns that are relevant.
Similar to traditional CBT for mental health problems, we also find it helpful to make a distinction between various levels of belief. So in this case, we specifically distinguish between what we call criminogenic thinking patterns and criminogenic thoughts. Criminogenic thinking patterns emerge from individual experiences, environmental circumstances, and an individual's unique reinforcement history. Patterns are abstract and they operate like rules or assumptions that people live by, and they produce the criminogenic thoughts. You can think of patterns sort of like wearing a set of goggles that colors the world a certain way. Thinking patterns are important because they influence thoughts over time and also across situations.
Criminogenic thoughts are more automatic. They spring up spontaneously in response to different events. They become the words that people utter out loud or to themselves, those permission-giving moments we described earlier. Because these patterns influence us across time and situations, they have the potential to lead to trouble in multiple risky areas. For example, let's take the thinking pattern of exploit. This pattern is all about sizing up people and sizing up situations and exploiting them for personal gain. A client who strongly possesses the exploit thinking pattern is going to manifest that pattern in a variety of ways across different situations. As you can see from the visual, that pattern might show up in the workplace. It might show up in relationships with friends, in relationships with family, even how the client parents their children. So what we're saying is that the pattern is going to produce a variety of criminogenic thoughts across different situations in the client's life.
Yeah, and keep in mind that not all the resulting decisions in the example on the slide are criminal. However, the presence of this pattern will put the client at risk for future criminality. Also, such thinking is likely to have a damaging effect on the client's relationships and career path. So, Damon, let's move on to how practitioners can get clients to talk about their criminogenic thoughts and thinking patterns so they can identify the most important patterns and start the change process.
Okay. When it comes to addressing criminogenic thinking, the initial challenge for most practitioners is that they don't know how to access their clients' thoughts and launch into productive conversations about thinking. And a parallel challenge for most clients is that they're unaware that they have these criminogenic thinking patterns. So kind of like we did in the real play exercise, the first stage is to bring the client back to an actual criminal event and the moment that preceded their antisocial decision-making, and ask the client an open-ended question that's likely to access those in-the-moment criminogenic thoughts. The question stems that you see on this slide can be adapted for just about any situation. Now, just because they're open-ended, that doesn't mean that clients will provide the information that you're seeking right away. Some clients will have difficulty accessing their thoughts. Some clients will provide you with feelings rather than thoughts. And some clients will provide one-word answers that aren't very helpful. So gentle persistence is often required. You may need to ask the client multiple times and in multiple ways in order to get them to verbalize those thoughts that they were having. But once they start to provide you with those thoughts, you'll be able to connect them to those larger 13 criminogenic thinking patterns. And those patterns that are most relevant for a particular client can then become the cognitive focal points for intervention.
So while the first stage is some assessment of the client's thinking, the second stage is to build the client's awareness of the impact that their criminogenic thinking is having on driving their decision making. Remember that clients aren't aware of the connection between their criminogenic thinking and their destructive decisions. But practitioners can bring that to their client's attention by guiding the client in an exploration of the different ways that the thinking has emerged in their lives and the different ways that has impacted them in terms of arrests, community supervision, relationships, jobs, money, and other life areas.
The third stage is a kind of inverse to the second stage. Because the client doesn't always make destructive decisions, it's important to elicit from the client the better thinking that occurs in those moments when they could have made a destructive decision, but instead made a healthier choice. And in later interventions, the strengthening of that pro-social thinking becomes even more central.
Shall we listen to an example?
Yes. In just a moment, you're going to hear a recording of what we call an RTD sequence. That stands for risks, thoughts, decisions. We've developed RTD sequences for the main criminogenic needs: work, school, substance misuse, criminal companions, unproductive leisure, family. We also have one for anger. The one you're going to hear is the one that's built around criminal companions, and it can be used with adult or juvenile clients. All of the RTD sequences are built around a common structure. That structure starts with eliciting from clients their criminogenic thinking in a specific risk area. That's steps 1 and 2. Then the sequence moves to examining the relationship between the client's thinking and their destructive actions. You can see that on the slide in step 3. Then the sequence moves to tackling the other side of it, the thinking that occurs in the times when they're in the risky situation and they make good decisions. You can see that in steps 4 and 5. And then sequences wrap up with the practitioner highlighting for the client the difference in thinking and how it leads to different outcomes, and then evoking from the client how they might strengthen that better thinking voice.
And on the slide is the script that's used to guide this type of interaction. And just one comment about using scripts. It's important to follow the ordering, and we actually recommend using the wording on the script since it's been field tested many times over. You can certainly add some extra content between each of the moves listed on the script to keep the conversation going smoothly. However, it's important not to lose the structure of the conversation. And we've done this with many case managers and probation officers over the years, and we found that it's usually a mistake to try to memorize the script. We've seen practitioners try and do this, and they get stuck in their own heads during the conversation. Instead, we recommend to simply let clients know you're going to be looking at a worksheet and also talking to them. We've never had a client object to this approach, and after doing the conversation a handful of times, you can put the script away. It's best to think of scripts like training wheels. They get you up and running.
The recorded work sample you're going to hear is based off of a real office visit between a probation officer and an adult client. Due to confidentiality issues, we transcribed it, we altered the identifying information, and we asked a retired probation officer and a graduate student to reenact it for you. So, Chip, let's give it a listen.
Hey, Daniel, thanks for coming in. Today, what I'd like to do with you is to go over this worksheet. It's a little different than some of the stuff we've done before. I'll be going over the worksheet as a guide, but I'll also be talking with you as I go through it.
Okay.
So, all right. So looking back over the past year or so, tell me about a friend or acquaintance that you tend to get in trouble with, like with the law. You know, someone who's been a bad influence to you in some way.
Um, I'd probably say my cousin Tyler.
Your cousin Tyler.
Yeah.
Um, so what is it about Tyler that makes him a bad influence or seems to get you into trouble?
Um, like he's not a bad guy. He just does whatever he wants to do, He smokes, he hangs out, just does whatever he wants. Sometimes when I'm with him, it's like it's hard not to hang out with him and stuff like that.
Okay. So it sounds like he sometimes poses a problem for you, like when you're making decisions.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, well, what makes it hard for you to avoid spending time with him?
We grew up together. He's family.
Okay. So he's somebody close to you.
Yeah.
All right. Um, so give me an example of a time that you've gotten into some trouble with him.
So we go out to the club or we go out somewhere, if we're drinking or we're just hanging out sometimes, a couple of times, things have happened where I've had to, kind of step up and we've had to fight
Okay.
over something like at the club. If we go out, like things are popping off, like I got to do what I got to do. I got to help him out, because I can't let him fight on his own.
Okay. So it seems like, being that you're family, you kind of feel obligated to help him out. And when you're under the influence.
Yeah. We'll go out and stuff like that, usually when we go out clubbing sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes,
Okay. Well, what did you tell yourself when you agreed to step into that fight with Tyler?
Like, I don't know, like, I can't just let him go at it alone.
Okay. Tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, if he's looking like he's going to fight somebody and that person has boys or something like that, like, I can't let him go at it alone. Like, I can't let him just get beat up. I can't just watch him get into it, by himself.
Okay. So it seems like that obligation for standing up for him is something that plays a big role in your mind.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's try the other side. Okay. Give me an example of when you're able to avoid Tyler's influence, or maybe potentially a bad situation with him.
So sometimes, like, if he calls me to go somewhere or he calls me to go out and I know he's in that mindset or something like that and I'm just not for it, so I just chill and I just tell him I have something to do, or, like, I go to be, like, there to babysit or something.
Okay. So apparently when he calls you, you kind of already know what's going on with him. And tell me more about what gives you that thought of saying, hey, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't go with him. Let's really think about the thoughts that were going through your mind that make you make this decision of saying, hey, and there's no way, I just can't go with him. I just can't do it.
I don't know. I think about, like, I don't want any more legal problems, I don't want to have to deal with any, like, the courts anymore. I don't want to have to deal with just being in trouble, like, I'm tired of being on probation. I'm like, I just want to move on with my life. And I know, like, sometimes hanging with him is going to pull me back into that, back into getting in trouble and stuff like that. So, I'm thinking I just don't want to be in any more trouble.
You don't want any trouble. What else? What else are you thinking?
I think about my family, my kids. I think about, my girl. I think about jail. I think about probation, I think about all these things, like, that I got to be worried about.
Yeah. All right. So that's great. So how has it worked out for you?
Sometimes, like, it depends, if I'm in the mood where maybe he calls me and I'm in a bad spot and, he's in a bad spot, I may want to get away, and I think that's when I give in a little more, but for the most part, yeah, I found that if I'm not feeling like going nowhere, I just don't go, and it works. I haven't seen him. It's been like about a month now.
Okay. All right. So just to kind of sum all this up, it seems like Tyler has been somebody that's been an influence in your life. It seems like You know, like when you're hanging out with him and you're in that situation and maybe you're going to go out, you're thinking in your mind, like, I have to protect him. He's my family. I care for him. I'm responsible for him. And that can lead to you getting into trouble. And then on the other side, you know, when you want to make better decisions and knowing that, hey, if I go out with Tyler, that can lead to more issues, you tell yourself, hey, I don't want to go back to jail. I don't want to find myself in a bad position. I want to be able to stay here with my family. And, you know, I don't want to get arrested. It seems like you tend to kind of say, I don't want to hang out with him. I'm going to let him go out on his own.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So, what can you do to kind of make the better thinking voice in your head stronger? Now, be real specific about this.
Probably just remind myself about all the things, you know, I've been through,
Mm-hmm.
the stupid stuff that has gone wrong when I go out with Tyler.
Okay. What else?
I can spend more time with my kids. So I don't have time to just, you know, hang out. You know, it's time for me to grow up, and I'm getting way too old to, like, just keep getting in trouble and stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you definitely did a good job today, Daniel, and I appreciate you coming in and doing this worksheet with me.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, good. Yeah, you did a great job with it. Now, well, let's kind of go over some of the other things with your probation. Any police contact?
No.
How about any drug use?
No, nothing. No drinking either.
Okay. You're still going to the support program, right?
Yep.
Okay. And your address, you're still on Melrose with your girlfriend?
Yeah, 117. Yep. I'm still working at the IGA.
Okay, great. Hey, are there any questions that you have for me? Anything going on that you think is important for me to know?
No. Just thank you, know, and I think this is, like, super helpful.
Great.
All right, Chip, let's highlight a couple of key takeaways from what we've heard. For me, at the heart of this conversation is the identifying with antisocial associates pattern. We heard that when he talked about the different thoughts that emerge when he makes choices with his cousin Tyler that lead him into violence and jeopardize his safety and his community supervision. And we also heard the better thinking, you know, that thinking that emerges when he's able to avoid his cousin's influence. And it seems to me that the better thinking not only allows him to make better decisions, but it's actually decisions that are more in line with what he truly values in his life. What's a key takeaway for you, Chip?
Well, you know, it's that we consider this a connecting sequence, in that what we're trying to do is connect the person's thoughts to their decisions. And for most people, they go through life on autopilot. They just sort of react to things around them. So we want to slow clients down. We want to build their awareness of their own thinking when they make bad and good choices. And this is useful for clients. It also provides an important roadmap for practitioners. Damon, anything else you want to touch on before we move on here?
Just one more takeaway for me is that the sequence is brief. And in this case, it had to occur during an office visit in a criminal justice setting. Office visits are typically very time limited in those settings. These sequences are brief by nature. They're organized like an ABC analysis in traditional CBT, and those are also meant to be brief and targeted in eliciting client thinking. But even though it's brief, this conversation isn't a one-shot deal or a single session endeavor. Like an ABC analysis, once you've identified the patterns and thoughts, those are like threads that you're going to keep pulling on. Therefore, it's important to hover around a thinking pattern over the course of treatment and build cognitive restructuring and behavioral activities to help strengthen that better thinking and weaken that criminogenic thinking.
Right. Once the criminogenic thinking is uncovered and understood, there's a whole host of activities that you can do to start to alter it. And here are a couple on the slide. One is to have in-depth discussions about how the thinking pattern has affected the client's life. It's kind of like a review of the things the person lost because they followed that particular way of thinking. Losses might be relationships, jobs, criminal justice problems, loss of freedom. Another strategy we sometimes employ, uh, which is self-monitoring, which is similar to how clients monitor their thoughts in traditional CBT in mental health treatment. We give the client a structured worksheet to keep track of when a particular criminogenic thought or thinking pattern emerges in their day-to-day life. These forms also have a space for the client to write a response to combat their own destructive thinking when it occurs. And another technique is to explore recent decisions that were both consistent and discrepant with better thinking. And so we go through decisions that come up since we saw the client last. And again, it's important to base this discussion on the client's real life examples.
Another technique for courageous practitioners is to role play the criminogenic thinking voice and then have the client practice talking back to it. We call that technique the two voices role play. And if you're interested in learning more about these techniques, they're covered in our books.
All right, let's talk about some common pitfalls to avoid when addressing criminogenic thinking.
Right. There are obviously a number of challenges when it comes to addressing criminogenic thinking. One of them is what we call the rear view mirror problem. It's easy to assess criminogenic thinking from a rear view mirror perspective, in which you ask clients to reflect on their attitudes toward their most recent offense or toward their past offenses. And when you do this, what you're likely to obtain are statements in which the client minimizes the offense or tries to avoid taking full responsibility for it. This maneuver typically produces justifications like it wasn't that bad, or, there's a lot of people out there doing worse things than me. And while justifications are important to understand, they're often not the critical aspect of criminogenic thinking, because the justifications are the thoughts that come after the destructive decisions and behaviors have been made, not before. We prefer to focus on the thinking that precedes the destructive decisions, the thinking that comes before, not after. This doesn't mean that asking clients about how they view their past criminal actions is unnecessary or unproductive. For example, asking them to look in the rearview mirror can reveal how they've mentally reinforced their behavior, which makes it more likely that it'll reoccur. It can reveal other relevant criminogenic thinking patterns in their risk profile. So justifications are important, but intervention around criminogenic thinking should not be done primarily as a rearview mirror endeavor. The focus should be on the thinking that comes before. What's another pitfall, Chip?
Well, there is another big one, and it has to do with the idea that there's an intuitive appeal for practitioners to focus on mental health symptoms and to assume that targeting those symptoms will reduce recidivism. However, criminal behavior is largely determined by larger criminogenic life areas, criminal friends, unemployment, substance misuse, and criminogenic thinking, just to name a few. Mental health difficulties will often contribute to, exacerbate, and sometimes can even be the on-ramp to problems in these criminal risk domain areas. For example, you can imagine symptoms related to schizophrenic spectrum difficulties, or maybe depression and anxiety, or traumatic experiences, that these can all lead to changes in relationships, routines, and habits. Clients might withdraw from work or school because of such symptoms, seek out substances to self-medicate. It might result in increasing the influence of negative peers. And so in such cases, a common mistake is to assume that by addressing symptoms themselves, one will automatically impact the entrenched patterns that are now driving the criminal behavior. So I would say that even for justice-involved clients who present with both mental health and criminal problems, which is really common, the cognitions that amplify their dysphoric symptoms will be different from those that drive their criminal decisions. So I think an exclusive focus on the thinking that drives mental health symptoms is ill-advised when working with clients if the goal is to reduce future justice involvement. And, we could talk about this topic quite a bit more. I know, Damon, you and I wanted to keep this recording brief, so we'll end this discussion where we started. I think in the face of life's challenges and struggles, all of us can engage in some criminogenic thinking. We may crave excitement, make justifications for a bad behavior, fail to sufficiently consider the impact of our actions on the suffering of others. And for some people, criminogenic thinking patterns become more prevalent and more automatic, and set the stage for the person to make decisions that lead to criminal behavior, cause harm to oneself and others, and create a cycle of justice involvement. Practitioners can help justice-involved clients by recognizing the client's criminogenic thinking patterns and making these the focus of CBT interventions. This requires bringing these patterns to the client's awareness and using CBT techniques to weaken the thoughts that precede antisocial decisions, while reinforcing and strengthening the pro-social thinking that precedes better decisions.
And this is a process that requires patience. Because criminogenic thinking patterns are likely to be long-standing and have a history of strong reinforcement, altering them is going to be a gradual process. And similarly, the strengthening of the healthier thinking patterns is going to take time too, because clients will need to experience the real-world reinforcement of these newer pro-social ways of thinking. So ultimately, addressing criminogenic thinking is a process. It's not something that occurs in 1 or 2 office visits. But when clients change their thinking, they reduce their likelihood of more justice involvement, and they increase their likelihood of pursuing the pro-social goals that can make life rewarding and meaningful.
So this discussion represents the way that we approach the topic of criminogenic thinking within a R&R framework. We hope you found it helpful. Thanks for listening.